From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's A.J. Tarpoff will advise you producers with cattle heading to grass to know the kinds of lameness that can occur in the herd, how to differentiate the causes, and how to respond with the proper treatment. Also today, the latest FSA Coffee Talk over from the Farm Service Agency, Carla Wikoff. She outlines the latest changes made to the Conservation Reserve Program, which she says ought to appeal to CRP participants. We'll walk through those numerous new features. And later on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee tells about cliff swallows and their beneficial appetite for insects. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along once more. Well, the cattle pasturing season is underway, or nearly so, for the bulk of you producers out there who run those programs. And so it's timely we bring by once more beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff, K-State Research and Extension, to remind us of the difficulties of cattle lameness while on pasture. And A.J., the root of that lameness can vary. You say start with the swelling of the hoof, and more times than not, that's indicative of a specific condition we're all familiar with.
It is, and that condition is known as foot rot. The first question that producers need to ask themselves is, number one, is there swelling? Number two, where is the swelling? And let's take, for example, that the swelling is in the foot. What does the swelling in the foot actually look like? Is it symmetric or is it asymmetric? And what I mean by that is one of the most common diseases that we deal with lameness, disease transfer, is foot rot. It is a bacterial infection of the foot. Foot rot has a symmetric swelling. Early in stages, we have a breakdown of the skin barrier. The skin barrier is a phenomenal barrier to the outside world. The bacteria that actually causes foot rot, Fusobacterium, also causes liver abscesses and a host of other issues. It's found naturally in the environment and the manure of cattle. But the skin barrier blocks all that keeps it on the outside where it should be. If we get a breakdown in the skin barrier, we allow this bacteria to get underneath the skin, subcutaneous, and that's where it thrives and it releases some toxins, and we get massive amounts of swelling that can occur rather quickly. The swelling actually occurs on the backside of the foot first, okay, almost just below the dew claws. We'll see a little mounding and a little bit of swelling. Then, as it progresses, the toes start to separate, and we get swelling that goes slowly up the leg. Okay, that is our prototypical foot rot. And it's always, you can smell a foot rot. Right. Producers out there right now are probably shaking their head that there is a very pungent, very specific odor that accompanies foot rot. These animals actually respond very well, especially in early stages of the disease, with injectable antibiotics. We have a lot of different options available out there, a lot of approved formulations. Some are over the counter, some are prescription. Work with your local veterinarian on what they want to prescribe or what they want to recommend in your specific area for treatment of foot rot. Just keep in mind there's a lot of options. They're all very effective in early cases. The longer we wait, we really run a risk of getting infection into the deeper tissues, the deeper structures of the foot.
Get on top of that, and that is in the familiar territory, foot rot, but there can be swelling in other joints in the animal.
And sometimes it confuses us. I mentioned structures deeper in the foot, and all the structures that are in the foot themselves, we have bone, we have joints, we have tendons, and skin. Foot rot is just underneath the skin. If we have structures deeper than that, that could have stemmed from sole abscesses. We had a sole bruise that got bacteria who formed an abscess underneath the sole of the foot. That infection gets a little bit deeper and gets into the bone or gets into the joints. This is where we often have non-responders. We treat them for foot rot, but they don't get any better. On further evaluation, we notice that the swelling is not symmetric. I mentioned that foot rot has symmetric swelling. Well, when the deep structures are affected, usually only one toe or one just above one of the toes is actually swollen. If you see a unilateral swelling or an asymmetric swelling, especially in the foot, that should ring a bell that something more sinister is at play. These deep structure infections, often we need to have some very specific therapy. An injectable antimicrobial, like we treat with foot rot, is not going to be enough. This is where we really need to do some further foot work. We might have to do a hoof trim to be able to pare out an abscess, to be able to clean up some of these structures, all the way to actually removing that toe in the nidus of infection to be able to get the animal back on its way to health.
One's veterinarian might want to intervene at this point.
Yes, that's where I very much recommend that if you see a unilateral swelling on a foot, make sure you call your vet, okay? Because chances are they're going to need a much more extensive therapy to get them back to production than just an injection with an antimicrobial.
Then, AJ, you say there are sources of lameness that do not create swelling and even more difficult to detect or identify?
They are. So we have some lameness issues that do occur relatively commonly in some locations, that they show up and we have these very odd lamenesses with no swelling. We know they're lame. We can see that they're painful, possibly on a limb or on a foot, but there's no swelling. This is where we really need to get close up and personal and actually visualize what's going on with the foot. The first condition that I'd like to discuss is called hairy heel warts. For years, this has just purely been known as a dairy condition, a confined dairy problem. We are seeing more and more of hairy heel, not only in our feedlot, but actually in some pasture settings as well. It's a different type of disease process where it's not systemic. Okay, this is a topical issue. What we'll see is we will see cattle that are normal one day. The second day, they are extremely lame. Whenever they go to walk, they're holding their foot up. Whenever they place weight on their foot, they actually walk on the very tips of their toes. And whenever we see that toe tip walking, okay, it's indicative of hairy heel wart, which actually develop just above the heel bulbs on the backside of the foot.
What instigates those?
You know, we assume that it's a type of bacteria called a spirochete. However, that being said, we don't understand the full pathogenesis or what actually develops or what causes this disease. But we do know that they respond very well to treatment when treated early. We assumed it to be a spirochete bacteria because we find that in the lab whenever we take some of those particles off the foot. So we don't fully understand the pathogenesis. It is considered infectious, will spread to other animals, but they do respond pretty rapidly with the proper therapy. Hairy heel is very specific, where if you give them an injectable antibiotic, they will not respond. That's only for if there's a secondary infection. Hairy heel by itself, we actually use topical therapy. Okay, there are sprays, there are powders, there's different products to be able to dry out those lesions, and it's amazing. They go from very lame to almost completely sound. Their progression and healing and drying those lesions happens rapidly, okay, assuming that we get the proper therapy.
And then there are what are simply described as abscesses, the toe abscess in specific here, and that is also somewhat commonplace, you say, AJ.
It is. So toe tip abscesses or toe tip necrosis, toe abscesses, whatever name you've heard, and sometimes there's a mixture of some of those that are used in the industry. This is more common with our freshly arrived stocker cattle, backgrounding cattle, or feedlot cattle. Okay, so these are fresh cattle coming off a range, coming from a feedlot, coming from a cow-calf operation, coming from an auction facility. They've been on a truck for a long period of time. We see it more commonly with a little bit more flighty animals. Okay, they're a little bit more high-headed. They might not have been handled quite as much. Possibly they came from a wet environment where their hooves could be a little bit soft. It's a traumatic breakdown of the sole and the hoof wall where they come together. It gets ground down enough to allow bacteria inside the hoof wall. And once that bacteria gets in there, it forms an abscess. Think about if you slammed your thumb with a hammer and just that throbbing pain, and sometimes you might have to relieve that pressure. Well, that's essentially what we need to do with these toe abscesses. So toe abscesses are very troubling to treat. It's even tougher to diagnose because oftentimes we do have to pick up the feet and actually use hoof testers to determine which toe is effective. We can nip just the tip of the toe off to relieve the pressure to allow drainage, and then it's kind of a long time to recovery. These animals, to fully heal and to fully develop and regrow that sole, can take a little while. So these are kind of our special needs cases where we'll have them in a rest and a recovery pen that's well bedded, where they can lay down, and it gives them the maximum ability to be able to heal. The last lameness that I've received a handful of calls that, it's pretty common this time of year. Our calves are getting a little bit older. We've had some temperature fluctuations. They might be changing location. They're going out into green lush pasture, just turned out stalkers, and unfortunately they got respiratory disease. We treat them for respiratory disease. They appear to heal very well, and about a week or 10 days later, they come up with a big swollen joint. Not down in the foot, but actually some of our big joints, the carpus, the stifles, the hocks, where they end up with a big swelling on those joints. This is actually a polyarthritis. It's a septic arthritis, and it happens secondary to bovine respiratory disease because a couple of the bacteria that are associated with the issues in the lungs get through the body and seat inside those joints. These polyarthritis cases, they're also a little bit difficult to treat. It takes a long time to recover. We can treat and destroy the bacteria that are in the joints, but it takes a long time for the body to resorb all the inflammatory cells inside the joint. So keep in mind, when you have an arthritic calf, just like toe abscesses, they need a nice bedded, clean area where they can rest, they can lay down and heal. They need easy access to feed and water, and they're not going to be able to move. Their mobility is impaired enough. They're not going to be able to keep up with the rest of the group. That's generally when we bring them into a rest and recovery area. So that's the last one. Those are the common ones that are happening right now, or producers will see or potentially see during the grazing season.
And the reason we cover this, it's highly important, obviously, for you producers to distinguish between these various kinds of lameness that can afflict cattle out on grass. So be aware of those differences, and of course, as AJ has said multiple times, do use the expertise of your veterinarian in assessing all of that as well. AJ, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That from beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff, K-State Research and Extension, our guest on this part of Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. We're back now on this Agriculture Today and with another installment of FSA Coffee Talk, our regular get-together to discuss what's happening with USDA programs via the Farm Service Agency. And over from the FSA State Office is an agricultural program specialist, Carla Wikoff. Carla has a boatload of information on things happening with the Conservation Reserve Program. Carla, welcome once again, and we see several upgrades and other things being implemented with the CRP. Pretty dynamic times right now for the program, aren't they?
Yes, they are. It's pretty exciting, actually. So the new administration's looking over some of the things that are going on with the conservation programs, and they announced some programs. I think it was, around the 21st of April, they made an announcement, and just going to provide you with some of those highlights of those items that they're looking at. National Office is still working on all the fine-tuning, getting all the exact rules and all of that, so we're kind of in an in-between period right now, but I think some of these things people will be very interested to hear, especially if they're interested in the CRP program.
And you say rental rate changes might be among them?
Yes, that's one of the big items in there, is that they're looking at adjusting soil rental rates. We had some conversations with some producers that Some of those rental rates had gone down from previous years and had some concerns with that. So they're listening to that, and they're looking at soil productivity indexes on soil rental rates, which they've done in the past. So more productive soils would have a higher soil productivity index and have an opportunity to maybe have a higher soil rental rate. It also could actually make some go down in some of the soils that are not quite as good. But we're looking at the positive side on this. So the other item for soil rental rates is they're looking at doing a one-time 10% inflationary adjustment for the soil rental rate for the life of the CRP contract. So that would add some more money also on top of that rate. Just to give you kind of an example, if you had a rental rate of $100, it starts out with a county rate at $100, you would get that additional $10 as the inflationary incentive on there. They still are using that factor because it's statutory. They can't make a change to that. So the 85% would still come into play for general sign-up and 90% for continuous. And then if they look at the soil productivity rate, which the highest that it can be is 1.5, just as an example, for a general CRP soil rental rate, it would bring it up to 141, and for a continuous, it would bring it up to 149. So just to kind of give a little example of what they're looking at, and that's just an example. That's not what the rate necessarily will be. I just was starting with $100 because that was kind of an easy number to look at.
The finer-tuned numbers will be forthcoming, as you say.
So the other thing they've added is they've increased the practice incentive payments. So on continuous CRP practices, they had a 20% incentive, and they're changing that and bringing it up to 50%. So that's based on the actual cost of establishing the cover, the permanent cover on that CRP as an incentive there. Another thing that they've added is an increase for any water quality practices. It was 10%, and they're looking at 20% now on that. So that's also continuous CRP practices, and those are usually like grass waterways, riparian buffers, or filter strips that kind of fall in that area. So one of the other items that they're looking at making changes, the state acres for wildlife enhancement. So we call that our SAFE practices. Mm-hmm. In Kansas, we have a couple of those. That, because it's continuous CRP, it's a year-round sign-up. In the past, before this change, the grass practices were considered general CRP practices. Now, with this update, those will all go back to continuous CRP. So then they would be eligible for those incentive payments also on top of their regular payments. Yeah. So several little things that they're doing to make CRP look a little better financially to help with that. And one other thing that they're looking at is the highly erodible land incentive. We call it the HELI practices. That's when the land that they're offering has a weighted erodibility index of 20 or greater on the offered acreage. So that one is going to be eligible both under general sign-up and continuous CRP based on whatever practice that they're putting in. So once again, those just flow along with, general CRP, if you remember, is competitive, and you have to come in. There's a certain sign-up period for that, and you come in and put your bid in for that. For continuous CRP, it's not competitive. You come in and you bid in at the rate that's acceptable, and then if it meets all the eligibility requirements, then it's approved. It can be approved right away.
Quite a bit happening here. The nugget, though, comes back to that cost share boost.
Yes. In
so many ways.
Yes.
That's going to be the carrot, if you will, for a lot of folks.
Yes. And that inflationary adjustment, that 10%, will help a little bit along the way also.
There's new terminology called climate smart practices. Those or that has been woven into the CRP as well, Carla? That's
right. It's another incentive, actually. So it can be general in CRP, and it's based on the type of practice that you're putting in on your CRP offer. And that incentive, it can be for establishment of trees, permanent grasses, development of wildlife habitat or wetland restoration. And each one of those incentives are based on the practice that you're putting in, and they're $3, $5, or $10. So as you probably guess, the $10 ones are probably going to be like tree practices, something that's more permanent on that land. But I would just encourage everyone that when we get the final information, if you have any interest in CRP, to contact your service center and set up an appointment and visit with them. One thing I do want to note to make sure you understand, we have several people that have already come in and signed up for general CRP sign up. So there'll be some changes that will be on those too based on this information. And like I said, we don't have this hasn't all been finalized, and we don't have all the details yet. We're kind of in between right at the moment. But you will be getting a phone call or a letter or a card to tell you to come and visit your county office and look at those offers that you've already submitted. So stay tuned. We're going to have some more information coming out. And as soon as those are finalized, as soon as that policy's been finalized and we have that, we'll get that information out to everybody.
Excellent. And you note also, Carla, that as per the CRP grasslands, you have a status update on that phase of the program.
That's right. That's another part we've talked about before, CRP grasslands. They were going to start that as soon as the general CRP sign-up was over. Well, we're still waiting because general sign-up's still ongoing, making these changes now too. So that will start after the general sign-up ends, but we don't have those dates yet because they're, like I said, working on policy and finishing up updating the software and getting through that process. They're hoping early summer will be that sign-up. We don't have a date yet. One thing they did add with these changes for CRP grassland, they'll now have a minimum per acre rate of $15. So, some counties that won't change anything. Some counties that had that rate that was lower than that will definitely help those counties. So a minimum rate for the CRP grasslands will be $15 now.
All right. To reemphasize, the finer details are being fleshed out, right, and those will be forthcoming. But producers need to understand that there are these changes and positive, friendly changes in large part for producers, and they just need to keep that dialogue with their local FSA folk on what's happening here.
That's right. If you have any interest, like I said, just make contact with your service center and set up an appointment, and they'll work with you to help you through the process.
Well, we know how well the Conservation Reserve Program has been ingrained into Kansas agriculture and our farm and ranch land out there. So CRP, always topical. And Carla, thanks for coming over and letting us know what is likely coming down the pike here in the relative near term. Looking forward to a further update as those details fall into place. Appreciate you coming by.
Thank you. And we will we'll get back with you as soon as we get that information finalized so everybody can hear.
We'll welcome you back in, you bet. Carla Wikoff with us, Agricultural Program Specialist with the Farm Service Agency, State Headquarters for Kansas. That's the very latest on changes to the Conservation Reserve Program for you on this FSA Coffee Talk, presented every other Tuesday right here. Speaking of USDA programs, this quick footnote: the agricultural economists here at K-State have just updated the estimates for the 2020-21 marketing year average price for the ARC and PLC payment calculations. K-State's Rich Llewellyn and Art Barnaby bring those up to date on a monthly basis. They note that all of the estimates were higher than a month ago, which makes sense with grain prices, particularly futures, moving higher in the last month. You can find all of that information on the agmanager.info website, agmanager.info. Now we'll step aside for the next few moments. When we come back, today's agricultural news headlines. K-State's Mike Brook also stands by with this week's edition of Milk Lines, and K-State's Charlie Lee on wildlife management. Still ahead here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Well, in the latest crop progress and condition report for the state of Kansas from the USDA for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in the state, 4% surplus, 69% adequate, 27% very short, and subsoil moisture exactly the same, 4% surplus, 69% adequate, 27% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop in Kansas this week, still 55% good to excellent, 31% fair, and 14% poor to very poor. And the winter wheat at the jointing stage is now at 83%. That's near the 5-year average. Wheat headed is now at 12% behind the 27% average. Corn planting is at 36%. Behind the 41% average, 14% emergence there. Soybean planting at 11%. That's ahead of the 5-year average. And cotton planting equal to the average at 1%. Also, range and pasture conditions in the state, 57% good to excellent, 32% fair, 11% poor to very poor. As for what's happening in crop conditions on the national scene now, we turn it on over to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey has the latest look at planting progress for corn.
Huge jump in overall corn planting to 46% complete by May 2nd. That is a 29% jump over the last week, and that puts the overall corn planting pace 10 percentage points ahead of the 5-year average.
He says corn emergence will take a while to catch up.
Just 8% by May 2nd. That is 1 point behind the 5-year average of 9%, ahead of last year's 7%. And so the corn that was thrown into the ground over the last week, we'll see that emergence taking place in the next week or two.
Meanwhile, he says soybean planting progress was not as impressive.
Looks like a lot of producers went to corn at the end of April and into the first couple of days of May. But even with that, we saw a tripling of the soybean planting pace. A week ago, 8% planted. The May 2nd number, 24% of the soybean acreage planted.
The pace of winter wheat heading is behind schedule.
We're seeing just 27% of the overall winter wheat crop headed on May 2nd. That's well behind the 5-year average pace of 34%, also behind last year's 30%.
Rippey says there are signs of heading in the major Central Plains production areas. Meanwhile, winter wheat condition has stabilized.
The national condition, 48% good to excellent. That is a 1-point drop from last week, not much. And no change in the very poor to poor rating, steady at 19%. So as a result, this year's crop currently rated lower than the crop was this time a year ago.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Next up on Agriculture Today, the weekly segment for you dairy producers, milk lines, and standing by is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning feed margin on their dairies. And as we've seen the corn and soybean markets both advance and continue to advance in price, feed cost becomes a greater concern for us on our dairy operations. So one of the things that I want you to think about is the amount of margin that you're actually receiving for the amount of milk that cows are producing. And the thing that you might want to take a look at is those late lactation cows in your herd. You know, on most of our dairy herds, we've got a fair number of animals that are still lactating, but they're not pregnant. They're actually animals who are just kind of waiting around to call. So one of the things you might think about is what is the minimal amount of milk that she actually needs to be producing in order to cover just the feed cost of keeping her around on the dairy. Well, one of the ways you might want to look at that is these late lactation cows generally don't eat as much as our early and high-producing animals. So let's say that their average dry matter intake of your late lactation cow might be 52, 53 pounds of dry matter. And let's say that that dry matter was worth about 13.75 cents per pound of dry matter. That means your daily feed cost for that particular animal is about $7.15. If your milk is only worth about 16.5 cents per pound, that means that she has to give at least 43 pounds just to pay for the feed that she's consuming on your farm every day. Now, fact of the matter is she's destined to leave your herd and become part of the beef industry. So the question is, when do I pull that plug? If she's not even paying for a feed cost because of low production, let's say she's only producing 35 pounds, well, the decision might be pretty easy. It's time to probably move her off the farm. Now, that would be in the case where she's an open animal and she's been designated as an animal that we're going to cull after this lactation. Now, some other things you might want to think about is this going to have a negative impact on my balance sheet? Well, it's one less animal on inventory, so you need to think about how it's going to impact that. The other thing that you might want to consider, or what some people think about, is just the total amount of milk that they're shipping. Obviously, you're going to be shipping less milk, so that means some of your feed costs on a per hundredweight of milk produced are actually going to increase as a result of that, because you have fewer pounds of milk to spread those fixed costs over. Now, that's one situation. Another situation you need to think about is those animals that are in late lactation but they're pregnant. And that's a little different question. Those animals are animals we're going to keep around for another lactation after they calve. So if we dry her off early, that means that we're going to have to start paying to feed her as a dry cow. Now, dry cows are cheaper to feed than maybe what a lactating cow would be, and maybe it costs $2 a day to feed dry cows on your farm. So you probably need to subtract that from the total cost of feeding for a lactating cow. So maybe now our cost is $5.15. In other words, if we keep her lactating versus drying her off, that means our minimal amount of milk that she needs to produce is about 31 pounds. So you've really got two groups of cows you need to think about. Those late lactation cows that are not pregnant and will be exiting your herd, and then those animals that are pregnant and you would like to keep them lactating because you do not want them to have an abnormally long dry period. A little bit different measure that we use for those. Then the final thing I want to you to think about in terms of milk margin is late lactation cows that are still eating the high group TMR. When we look at the cost of putting together a diet for an animal that's producing 90 pounds of milk versus one that's producing 60 pounds of milk, there's a large difference in feed costs. So if you just have one production group on your farm, if you're feeding everybody for that 90 pounds of milk, but you got a large group of cows that are only producing 50 or 60 pounds of milk, maybe you need to consider two different diets, a high diet and a low diet, and that'll help you through these tough times that we're experiencing in terms of feed cost. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Many thanks, Mike. After one final break, another wildlife management visit with K-State's Charlie Lee. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Next up on Agriculture Today, our time set aside every week to talk wildlife management. Joining us once more, former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. For those not familiar with this bird, you're going to introduce it to us today, Charlie, the cliff swallow. And right out, you might describe what it is. This is different from the common barn swallow, you say.
Yes, these cliff swallows often swarm around bridges and overpasses in the summer. They show avian life and feeding habits. They often are found right over water wetlands. They describe them as being very small in size, sparrow-sized or smaller. An adult may be a little over 5 inches in length with a weight of about perhaps 1 ounce, maybe just a little bit more than 1 ounce in size. They have rounded, broad-based wings, a small head, and a medium squared tail. In the color pattern, they look brownish and have dark throats with white underparts. In good light, you'll see kind of metallic dark blue backs, similar to what you see on barn swallows, and pale pumpkin-colored rumps. They have a kind of a brick red face and a bright buff white forehead patch. It almost shines like a headlamp. If you go by those highway passes at night and take a few moments and look very carefully, you might see them peeking out of the domed-over nests that they've constructed under many of our highway overpasses and bridges.
And those nests are part of their uniqueness, you say?
Yeah, the nests are really unique in that the amount of energy that they put into constructing one of those nests. They can nest solitary, but they usually nest in colonies. Those colonies seem to be smaller in the eastern part of the United States, but further west they can get up to over 3,700 cliff swallows in one area in Nebraska. They construct those nests in a secure place because that's critical to their breeding success, so they spend a great deal of time and energy in building activities. There's been some recent work in how much energy perhaps is expended in constructing those nests, but keep in mind, without a successful nest, their reproductive success is going to be zero. So they must spend a considerable amount of energy in order to be successful. A typical cliff swallow nest weighs about 25 times the adult swallow body mass. It may require as many as 1,800 trips to the mud source and may take as much as 15 days to construct. It's been projected to cost energetically about 40 calories. Now, that doesn't seem like very much when we have a body mass of people of our size, but when you think of a bird that weighs 1 ounce and expending 40 calories, they've got to catch a lot of insects in order to meet that energetic demand.
They're burning a lot of calories, but they are voracious insect consumers.
Yes, cliff swallows eat flying insects year-round. They forage during the day in smaller groups, all the way up to groups that may be over 1,000 birds. They feed on the wings in above grassy pastures, plowed fields, or open areas, but also over floodplains and over rivers, lakes, wetlands. Their diet consists of many types of flying insects, particularly those species that are swarming insects, such as the bugs, flies, bees, wasps, ants, lacewings, mayflies, butterflies, grasshoppers, crickets, dragonflies, and even damselflies are consumed on the wing by cliff swallows.
They are beneficial in that respect. Are they a year-round bird in this area, or do they migrate, much as other birds do, Charlie?
No, they're a migratory species. They go south in the winter. Some of them will start leaving in August, go all the way perhaps to northern Argentina. They come back in Kansas in the spring and mid-April.
Do they have any natural enemies out there that they have to be wary of?
Well, cliff swallow predators include some of the hawks, like sharp-shinned hawks, even American kestrels, loggerhead shrikes, barn owls, great horned owls, red-headed woodpeckers, then some of the reptiles like gopher snakes, rat snakes, coach whips, all have figured out ways to get into cliff swallow colonies and feed on young.
But once more, you say they are abundant enough. They are in no way endangered whatsoever by predators or otherwise, that they're doing quite well?
Yeah, cliff swallows are numerous. Their populations have been stable for perhaps the last 50 to 60 years. I think there's globally a breeding population of over 40 million birds, with almost 80% of those breeding in the United States, another 12% in Canada, and about 10% in Mexico. They seem to be doing well, perhaps greatly increased in numbers from historical times, primarily because their breeding habits have been improved by bridges, buildings, and culverts where they have protected areas in order to build those nests, where previously they were out in more hazardous type areas.
So right there is where one might want to look if they've never seen a cliff swallow before or a roost of swallows of this type, those structures would be the place to start.
Yes, looking under any of those man-made structures, usually those highway bridges over rivers or small streams, you're almost sure to see cliff swallow nests here and throughout much of Kansas.
And the main thing there, once again, they can be considered a plus in as far as some of the pesky insect problems that they can put a dent in as they feed aggressively on many insect species, as Charlie told us here. And Charlie, thanks for this glance to, again, the cliff swallow. Charlie Lee is a former wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, that closes out today's broadcast. To remind, you can have each day's program automatically downloaded to your mobile device in podcast form. Visit agtoday.net and sign up for that free service, or simply to hear a replay of that day or any other day's broadcast, agtoday.net. In the meantime, please be back with us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.